Hello everyone. Today's book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism, by Mattias Desmet, talks about totalitarianism not as a relic of the past, but as a chillingly relevant force in our modern lives. Desmet starts by recounting a serene morning in November 2017, where he found himself gripped by a profound realization. A new form of totalitarianism was taking root in our society. But this wasn't the totalitarian regime of old, led by charismatic dictators. No, this was something far more insidious, driven by the relentless march of technology and the creeping influence of bureaucratic control. Back in 2017, the signs were already there. Governments were tightening their grip on our private lives, eroding our right to privacy, especially in the wake of 9/11. Alternative voices were being silenced, particularly in the climate debate. Security forces were becoming more intrusive, and the list goes on. But it wasn't just governments. The rise of woke culture and the climate movement was fueling a demand for a hyper-strict government from within the population itself. Terrorists, climate change, heterosexual men, and eventually, viruses were deemed too dangerous to be handled with traditional methods. The technological tracking and tracing of populations became not just acceptable, but necessary. This was the dawn of a new totalitarianism, one led not by flamboyant leaders like Stalin or Hitler, but by the dull, unassuming figures of bureaucrats and technocrats. It was a vision that echoed the dystopian fears of philosopher Hannah Arendt, who warned of a society where the distinction between fact and fiction, true and false, ceased to exist. Desmet realized that to understand this new totalitarianism, we had to delve into its psychological roots. Traditional dictatorships rely on fear, using the threat of violence to control the population. But totalitarianism is different. It thrives on a more insidious psychological process: mass formation. Mass formation is a kind of group hypnosis that erodes our ethical self-awareness and critical thinking. It's a process that sneaks up on us, and before we know it, we're caught in its grip. People become willing to sacrifice their personal interests for the collective, intolerant of dissenting voices, and susceptible to pseudo-scientific propaganda. It's a phenomenon that transcends logic and reason, leading to behaviors that are, frankly, shocking. But the story doesn't end there. In the months and years that followed, he began to see connections between totalitarianism and another crisis brewing in the scientific world. The replication crisis, which erupted in 2005, exposed a staggering level of sloppiness, errors, and even fraud in scientific research. Up to 85% of research papers in some fields were reaching completely wrong conclusions. And the most alarming part? Most researchers were convinced they were doing everything right. This crisis revealed a fundamental flaw in our scientific worldview. The mechanistic-materialistic view of the world, which reduces everything to numbers and statistics, was failing us. It was creating a scientific fiction that bore little resemblance to reality. And this, in turn, was fueling the rise of totalitarianism. As Arendt pointed out, the ideal subject of a totalitarian state is not the convinced ideologue, but the person who can no longer distinguish between fact and fiction. Then, in February 2020, the world was rocked by the coronavirus crisis. It was a crisis that seemed to come out of nowhere, but in reality, it was the culmination of a series of increasingly desperate and self-destructive societal responses to objects of fear: terrorists, global warming, and now, a virus. The response to the virus was unprecedented. Nearly every country on Earth followed China's example, placing huge populations under de facto house arrest. The term lockdown was born, and with it, a surreal silence descended upon the world. The skies were empty of airplanes, the streets devoid of traffic. In India, the air became so pure that for the first time in 30 years, the Himalayas were visible on the horizon. But the transfer of power was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this crisis. Expert virologists were called upon to replace the unreliable politicians, tasked with running the animal farm with accurate, scientific information. Yet these experts soon revealed their own flaws. Their statistics and graphs were riddled with mistakes, and their promises of freedom after 2 doses of the vaccine proved hollow. The rules changed so often that only the experts seemed to know them. The coronavirus crisis exposed the dangers of blind trust in numbers. The data was anything but objective. The number of infections was determined by PCR tests, which were far from perfect. The estimates of infection rates were often wildly inaccurate, and the data on hospital admissions was distorted by financial incentives. Even the death counts were ambiguous, with the vast majority of COVID-19 deaths involving underlying conditions. This reliance on numbers created an illusion of objectivity, blinding people to the subjective nature of the data. It fueled a narrative that was often at odds with reality, leading to policies that were, in many cases, more destructive than the virus itself. The fear and anxiety that gripped the population were, in part, a result of this numerical illusion. The coronavirus crisis also highlighted the psychological dynamics of mass formation. The conditions were ripe for it. Widespread loneliness, a lack of meaning in life, free-floating anxiety, and frustration. The suggestive story of a deadly virus, coupled with the promise of control through lockdowns and vaccines, provided a focal point for the free-flowing anxiety. This process created a psychological gain. The anxiety was linked to a specific cause, and the disintegrating society regained a sense of coherence and meaning through a common struggle against the virus. The fight against the virus became a mission, laden with pathos and group heroism, and the frustration and aggression that had been building up were vented on those who refused to go along with the story. The leaders of the masses, whether they be politicians, experts, or media figures, play a crucial role in this process. They are not the masterminds behind the scenes, but rather figures who are themselves caught up in the mass formation. They are driven by a fanatical belief in the ideology that underpins the narrative, and they are often blind to the absurdity and destructiveness of the measures they advocate. The power of ideology is the real force at play here. It is the ideology of mechanistic thinking, with its promise of rational understanding and control, that shapes the actions of both leaders and followers. It is this ideology that creates the illusion of a conspiracy, as people struggle to make sense of the seemingly coordinated actions of those in power. So, what is the way forward? The answer lies in transcending the mechanistic worldview that has brought us to this point. We need to embrace the uncertainty and complexity of life, recognizing that the essence of things is not rationally knowable. We need to cultivate a new form of knowledge, one that is based on empathy and resonance with the world around us. This means letting go of the illusion of control and embracing the art of living with uncertainty. It means valuing individuality and creativity over conformity and control. It means recognizing that the ultimate knowledge lies outside of us, and that we can only receive it by tuning our vibrations to the frequency of things. As we conclude, I urge you to ask yourselves, are we willing to continue down the path of control and conformity, or are we ready to embrace a new way of being? The choice is ours. This has been a BrightLearn video from BrightLearn.ai on the book The Psychology of Totalitarianism by Mattias Desmet. Visit BrightLearn.ai for more fascinating videos like this one, and visit naturalnews.com for full editorial coverage and breaking news on critical stories that keep you informed and aware of what's really going on.